And good morning. Welcome everybody to our monthly Recovery Cafe volunteer training. We do this every month with the intention to build community amongst one another, to learn skills that will support our own recovery and others' recovery, to meet some local professionals and practitioners who have expertise to share with us, which helps us to make good referrals for the folks that we're working with at Recovery Cafe. Those are the main purposes. So the mission of Recovery Cafe is to build a community in which everyone experiences love, belonging, healing, and the joy of contributing. I'm excited to share that we have been open for a couple months now. We had our first day on March 11th. We are open on Thursdays from noon to 3 for lunch and Fridays 10 to noon for lunch. We did close this week for staff training, but going forward, those are our open days. We hope to be opening more times down the road, but that's what we have to offer right now. So this is a good time for me to make the invitation to all of you. If you feel so comfortable and so called to please come to Recovery Cafe, just to check it out in person. We've been doing these volunteer trainings for a year and a half now. And I think we've got a great community here that exists virtually. And we've been building skills and talking about the cafe and how do we apply these when we're there. And so, like I said, if you are comfortable doing so, now's the time. You don't need to schedule a volunteer shift. Please just come and join us. We'd love to have you share a meal with us. And again, any things that we've learned and talked about here in our volunteer trainings, you have support from staff. So you're not doing any of this alone. You have no responsibility or obligations for, besides your own safety. We will take care of that. So with that said, I want to introduce our guest presenter, Craig Isenberg, who runs a private practice here in Port Townsend. And I just want to let you take it away. If you don't mind, Craig, introducing yourself and however else we can help, let me know.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I know some of you, and it's good to see the faces that I see. My name is Craig Isenberg, and like Brian said, I have a practice in town, and I focus on individual counseling with teens on up, couples counseling and family work, and also work with a fair amount of addiction in my practice. I'm going to present today a little bit of kind of the foundation of where I got started doing family therapy, where I did some work with the Juvenile and Family Court and with CPS working with functional family therapy. And in that sort of work, I discovered some really helpful techniques as far as how to motivate and how to, how to encourage behavior change when clients and when families are struggling to find out how to do things different, or even motivated, finding motivation to do things differently. That work that I did for several years really helped form a foundation for me that then, as I learned more about attachment theory and different family kind of structural challenges, it was really, it's a big part of my practice and how I kind of the lens that how I see behavior, how I see family challenge. And so I'm hoping to share some of that with you today, but also I want to make sure that it's relevant to the work that you'll be doing at the Recovery Cafe, either as a volunteer, as a participant, and supporting friends and family members. So one part of the way I present, I really do love interaction. And so I understand some folks they're comfortable with their faces being on screen since this is a recorded session, others having their faces off screen. Those that are off screen, I'm not going to necessarily be able to see if you have something to add. So make sure that you can make yourself known. Send me a message if you have a question, or go off mute and speak up if you want to add to some of the questions that I'm asking. I just want to make sure not to exclude everyone. And then at the end, I'll leave some time for some question and answers and to clarify. And my disclaimer, as I was talking to Brian at the very beginning, is that this is my first time to present this topic in this format. And so I'm hoping that we may not get to everything. We may find that we have more time for question and answer at the end. So you're my guinea pigs in that. And so I'm just putting that up front. But what I'd love to start with, the topic is behavior change. And underneath that is, the question that I had when I thought of behavior change was how do we avoid conflict, or how do we decrease conflict? How do we minimize decreased defensiveness, if we're looking at behavior change or avoidance, or, one of the things that came up, I was thinking as Brian was talking, with the Recovery Cafe, there's a lot of interest and people are feeling the waters and deciding whether it's a fit, but there's also some very natural, very normal hesitation to engage in a new community. And so I'm hoping that this topic can help encourage folks about the aspect of community with the Recovery Cafe and it being a safe place, being a non-blaming, strength-based place and program. And so I'm hoping this can kind of cover some of that. And I'm curious, I'd like to just start and throw it out to everyone else so I get a sense of what would be helpful for you. I'd love to hear some current strategies when it comes to behavior change, when it comes to motivating your neighbor, motivating your friend, the person sitting across the table from you, and offering some support. What strategies do you typically utilize? What do you feel is the most effective or most natural approach that fits your personality? And then I'd also love to hear, what are some of the barriers that you bump up against? Where do you feel stuck at times? And I know we won't have time for everyone, but I'd love to hear a handful of ideas so we know kind of some different directions and where some of those challenges might lie.
Brian, this is Cecilia. And what I normally do is I listen and I don't participate in, I'm going to say the word paranoia. But yet he has reason to be paranoid because we are people of color and we do not walk this earth easily as people who are in the dominant culture. So how do I address, and he won't go to a therapist because he doesn't believe they can relate to him being a person of color. So how do I assist him or encourage him?
Okay. That's an I'm glad you brought that up. And so I'm hoping that this will cover a fair amount of sort of that resistance of how can it feel like a safe place to go to, knowing that not every place has felt safe in the past. So thank you for bringing that up. Other perspectives, other barriers. This is the time when I give some awkward silence so everyone has a chance to speak up.
I would say one of my barriers is trying so hard not to tell someone how to do something or what to do, not to give advice.
Okay.
So you kind of get to a spot where you've been listening and you're being honest, because I think that's really important and a good way to connect. But then there's kind of this awkward silence and you want to fill it with, well, I would. And so that's, I have to.
Great. Excellent point. And I can't wait to get to the topic because I think that's a really important piece, because when you're telling someone how or what to do, oftentimes some of that resistance might come from maybe you don't fully understand me if you're telling me what to do at this point. Sometimes questioning, are you listening to me if you're already telling me that how to address this situation?
One of the big issues for me is staying non-judgmental. I keep that in my mind all the time, because if you get a little judgmental, then you're going to say the things that are telling them what they need to do. So you have to keep that separate. You got to step back from judging whatever it is that they're saying and do listening, as someone else said, and sometimes I'll interject if I come up with something from my own personal experience, maybe something of a similar nature that I handled some way or whatever. But along with this, my biggest issue is I'm a Vietnam combat vet with post-traumatic stress, so I have learned certain ways how to deal with people. Sometimes I can take it and be successful. Other times I have to make that decision. It's time to leave. I have to get out of there. So there are a number of people with similar issues such as mine. It's much more common, and it's not just veterans that have post-traumatic stress, but it's something that more and more people need to be aware of, that there is a issue here for a lot of people that puts them in that spot, flight or fight, and you don't want to fight, so you leave.
Right.
And that's what I do sometimes.
Thank you, John. There's two excellent points in there. Well, actually, and they're clearly related. I think that non-judgmental piece, I think it also comes back to folks feeling like whatever resource, whatever support they're approaching is a safe one to do so. And I think a big part of that safety is knowing that they're not going to be judged, knowing that we're going to seek understanding and try to meet someone where they're at. And I think that also is similar to the comment about coming from a background where maybe it hasn't always been safe. If you're a person of color, or you're coming from a cultural background that may not always feel safe where you're at in that moment. And we can add PTSD into that equation, where we don't always understand what someone is showing up with, and what may be contributing to their comfort level or their discomfort level. And so that's a big part of why we don't jump into telling someone what to do right away, because if we don't truly understand, how do we know what's going to be the most supportive for them in that moment? So those are, I know there's a lot of other approaches, but I think I really appreciate you speaking up and sharing that, because I think that emphasizes for me why this topic is such an important one. Underneath it is that we have intent. Our intent is we want to help people and we want to support people. And some strategies tend to be more effective than others. And at the same time, there's not one strategy that fits all. So what I would like to introduce to you is a strategy that really encompasses our human nature. And I mentioned attachment and the work that I've done with attachment. And I think that is a really comfortable way for me to approach helping others, and a great way to seek understanding, to see what's underneath the problem. And if there's anything that you're going to take away from this class, it's that idea of attachment and how it can influence behavior. And what I mean by that is I look through kind of a strange lens of looking at human beings as pack animals. And when you think of pack animals, so right away a wolf pack comes to my mind. And I think of, how does a wolf survive in the wild? And a wolf survives in the wild through its pack. A lone wolf out in the wild is less likely to survive. We rely on that pack for food. We rely on that pack for shelter, for safety, for protection, all the things we need for survival. Humans are no different from that, except our pack looks very different in this modern age. It's not as obvious, and I like the comment about that fight or flight response, because when we feel like our pack is threatened, when we feel like we are being judged by someone, when we feel like we're being rejected or abandoned or looked down upon, that can trigger that fight or flight response. Because our pack is our survival, as soon as we feel like we're being looked at poorly or negatively by someone, we tend to put up the barriers. We tend to withdraw. We're either going to fight back, or we're going to walk away, or we're going to freeze in place and not know what to do in that moment. And so what I'm going to present with behavior change is, how do we address that attachment need, that need for connection, and how do we motivate for change, allowing people that we're working with, our close friends, our peers, our colleagues, our clients, how do we approach them in a way that they feel is safe? And that starts right at the very beginning. It starts right at the very beginning of, how do we enter the room? How do we engage with that person and allow them to feel comfortable and know that they are a part of our pack? And my practice, this is something that I find, and I couldn't find the research, but I remember in grad school learning that, we're learning all of this theory, all these different ways of approaching therapy. And the majority of the research shows, regardless of what modality, whatever approach you have, if you have a good therapeutic relationship with your client, you are going to be far more effective than any intervention that you're going to apply. And that goes the same with the volunteer work that you all do. It goes the same with how we interact with our friends. It's not necessarily the skill and tool, but it has to do with that connection, with that attachment. I was looking at, I tend to watch TED Talks every now and then when something good came up. And this one I came across several years ago, and I'm going to mispronounce the guy's name. I think it's Johan Hari. And I'm not sure how many of you have watched that TED Talk before, but the title says it all for me. He says, the opposite of addiction is connection. And he's essentially saying that if we're looking at a problematic behavior such as addiction, the way to cure that behavior isn't abstinence. It isn't sobriety, but it's connection, it's attachment. And we can apply that to just about everything that I work with. You know, we can apply that to relational issues and conflict. We can apply that to addiction and substance use issues. We can apply it to anger and aggression. We can apply it to all sorts of maladaptive behaviors that someone might take on. Oftentimes the opposite of that is going to be that connection and that secure attachment. And so when I'm working with a family, when I'm working with a client, or even that first phone call, the first thing I want to do is make sure that they understand that it's a safe environment. And so the first step that I'm going to do for behavior change and changing that process for someone is going to be the engagement. And so it has to do with how invested we are, how consistent we are we reliable in how we respond to someone? And this may sound really simple, but it's as easy for me as returning a phone call. You know, it's as easy as hearing what someone is experiencing and validating that experience. And following up, if I say that, hey, I have some ideas of some resources, I'll email you. It's making sure that I respond to that. And as this applies to the Recovery Cafe, I'd imagine it's consistency of showing up when you say that you're going to show up, you know, responding to text messages and phone calls when someone's reaching out. Of course, adhering to your own boundaries, but responding in a way that you had said that you would. And it's something as simple as giving the message to that person, I care about you and you're important enough to respond. And that right away makes it feel, okay, this is already becoming a safe place because I know that this person is going to respond to my needs, that they're trustworthy, that I can rely on them. And, you know, I again, in my practice, it means sometimes it's just returning a phone call in a timely way, returning an email in a timely way. That starts to build that attachment. But then there's the motivation piece. So they trust you because you're reliable, but that's not everything. You know, I think that's starting the foundation. And then it becomes, we look at how do we motivate someone? So how do we motivate them? How do we motivate them to change? In one direction, we can go at pointing out all the bad behaviors and why they're not working for them. What's the problem with that?
Mhm.
Jill?
Overwhelming.
Overwhelming.
Mhm.
Yep. Anything else?
It's a criticism.
Yeah. So even if the intent is really good, if it comes across as a criticism, if I say to somebody that, hey, what you're doing right now is bad, well, they're going to interpret that as being bad. And that may very well trigger that fight or flight response, or maybe not a fight or flight response, but a feeling of this person just labeled me as bad. I don't know if I can trust this person. I don't know if I'm comfortable. So we have to point it out in a way that might build that attachment. So the behavior might be bad in the way it's affecting that person, but that person isn't bad for wanting to address that behavior or acknowledging that this is a bad behavior that I'm struggling with, but I want you to see me as a good person. So instead of saying that this behavior is bad, I might say that behavior worries me, or that behavior has an impact, and kind of fill in the blank of what that impact might be. But now I'm building connection. I made it about me. I didn't make it about them. I said, that behavior really worries me. How do you feel about that? How does it affect you? Now I'm seeking understanding. I'm not immediately judging them as good or bad. Another aspect of that motivating is looking at, and this has been one of the most helpful processes for me, is not just the impact that the behavior might have, but what is the function of that behavior? So looking at what is underneath the behavior. It might very well be a dangerous behavior. It might be a bad behavior that has some negative consequences, but what are they trying to achieve from that? And this is a good way to frame that client in a positive light, saying, I know what you're doing is well-intentioned. It's not coming across that way, and that's what worries me and scares me. We can talk about addiction in that way. So if we talk about drugs and alcohol and say, we can say drinking is bad for you. We can say it's self-destructive. We can say it's causing all of these bad things, these legal issues, these health issues in your life, but that might not motivate that person to change. But when we understand what that function of the behavior is, we're telling that person that you're human and you're trying to deal with this issue, this challenge in the best way that you can. So we're no longer focusing on the addiction, but we're saying, I wonder when you drink, why you drink, what is that serving for you? So one common idea is, well, when you're feeling really uncomfortable, when you're feeling a lot of hurt and pain, you want to feel better. That's noble. That's understandable that anyone who's feeling an immense amount of pain is going to want that pain to go away. So drinking is one strategy. And so now we've relabeled that behavior as an attempt for that person to feel better. And so we've reframed it. We can use conflict in the same way. I think yelling is a really common one that I can run into with family, family sessions or couple sessions. And I'll see it firsthand in sessions often, less so over Zoom, which I'm really appreciating, but I think people are more comfortable in person. But voices escalate. What's the point of yelling at one another? Sometimes it can be threatening. Sometimes it can be, you're trying to hurt me through your voice, but more often than not, it's you're yelling because you're wanting to make sure that this person across the room from you or next to you is hearing you. So I say one thing and you don't respond in the way that I want you to. You don't agree with me in the way that I want you to. And so I'm going to raise my voice, or I'm going to repeat it, or I'm going to continue escalating until you acknowledge that what I'm saying is right. But then the problem with that, now that I've escalated that, now the focus is going to be on the yelling itself and not the message that I was trying to get across. And so I can relabel this when we look at that sort of behavior, like yelling at one another. I can see how badly it is that you want to be heard. What I'm afraid of is that the yelling gets the focus and not the important message that's underneath that yelling. So we've reframed it. We didn't say, it's bad, don't yell, they're not going to hear you. Now they feel shame, but you say, hey, I can see what you're saying is really important. It's important enough for you to raise your voice. I can only focus on the volume right now. Can we lower that volume so that you can get your message across? So we've set them in a way where they feel really seen and validated. Talk about attachment. You just acknowledged that I did this thing that is taking away from the important message that I have. So now there's absolutely no need to yell because I understand that you're wanting to hear what I have to say. I don't need to raise my voice for it. All sorts of other, reframes that we can offer. There's a question there. Oh, sorry. I thought I heard someone ask a question. Some other reframes that another favorite one of mine that I run into all the time with couples is, someone might say that so-and-so is lying all the time and it's really hurtful and I don't know what to do about it and I can't trust them. So when we can look at that person, we can say, why do you lie? That's bad. See, they don't trust you anymore. Well, now their fight or flight response, they're feeling rejected. But if we look at what's underneath that in a strength-based way, we can look at that lying as, what is underneath that lying? Well, you're lying because, you want to present yourself in a different light, right? We're lying because we don't want disapproval from the people that are most important to us. So now instead of pointing out the negative behavior of lying, we can say how important it is for this person you care about to not disapprove of you. You don't want to feel ashamed of something that you don't want them to know about. So you're protecting yourself, you're protecting the relationship, or you're protecting them. The important piece there is I'm not saying lying is okay, that, hey, good for you to protect the relationship, but I'm saying that I understand why you're lying. I understand why it shows up because you care about this relationship. I also understand that it's not the most effective way to preserve the relationship because your partner is over here saying that violates trust and it hurts her. So even though you're trying to protect the relationship, the outcome is having a negative impact on the relationship, in fact. So what are some other ways that we can approach protecting that relationship? There's not a single behavior that I can think of that there wouldn't be a noble intent. I have two young boys and one hits the other one over the head with a toy. I'm thinking they're actually older than that now. But when they were little kids, one hits the other one over the head with the toy. I could reprimand that behavior and say, that's bad. We don't treat each other that way. But ultimately, it was he hit the other one over the head with the toy because he wanted his attention and wanted him to play with him. Well, what are some more effective ways that we can do that? Because when you get hit over the head with a toy, you either cry or you hit them back, right? Or you walk away. But nothing about that is going to accomplish what you're hoping to accomplish, which is playing together. So this is my next, so I started out with engagement. How do we be responsive and show that we care? How do we motivate? So reframing that behavior in a positive light, in a more accurate light. We're not sugarcoating it. We're looking truly at what's underneath that behavior. And so my next one, if I just broke it down and this really does blend in, but what is that function of the behavior? So looking at what's underneath the behavior. And one of the comments was, one of the things I really try to be cautious of is be non-judgmental. And a big way to be non-judgmental is to seek understanding, to look at what's underneath that behavior. We don't always know, I gave some examples of lying or yelling and what the reframe might be to look at what's underneath that, but we often don't know. So we have to ask questions. We have to be critical thinkers. as someone's explaining their challenges and their frustrations, is to step away from that challenge that's in the moment. You know, I'm struggling with finances. I'm struggling with this drinking issue. I'm struggling with my relationship. But we also want to know what they're experiencing, what's underneath some of this struggle, because I see all of those things as potentially a symptom of something else that's going on. Something else that's going on in their life individually with some past trauma, something else that's going on, you know, in the relationship with feeling this unmet connection. So what's underneath that, and the behaviors that show up, like drinking, like conflict, and anything else that you might see, like depression, what's underneath that? You know, how do we address that in a way that can be strength-based? So again, we're looking at the intent of the behavior, what's underneath it, versus what the outcome of it is. Because my goal is, when we can identify what's underneath the behavior, we can then address it by finding more effective means of achieving that very same thing, right? You want to feel better. You want to be able to regulate your emotions better. You want to cope with this stress better. This is one way that you're going about it. Perhaps it's not the most effective way, or it comes with all sorts of negative outcomes in addition to addressing the thing that you're addressing. So how do we build something that feels more effective and more comfortable for you?
Hey,
Any
Craig.
questions so far?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you've used the term strengths-based approach a couple times, and I was just wondering if you could explain that a little further.
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes I just throw that stuff around thinking that everyone has the same vocabulary that I do. And so that's a word specifically used in functional family therapy. And it captures this approach that we're looking at strengths, we're looking at the positive, we're looking at the noble intent of what's underneath that behavior. So rather than pointing out the behavior as, hey, you need to stop doing that, it's bad, it's strength-based. So what's underneath that? The strength-based is, you're trying to feel better and cope with this difficulty through this behavior, or you're trying to get this important message across. And so does that answer that? I kind of just threw that in there without.
Yeah, no, I think it does. Would you have any feedback when someone is having a really hard time finding strengths in the person they're working with?
Feedback for the person that is trying
Yeah, so
to
let's
help?
say I'm in the helping role, and I'm working with somebody, and I'm having a really hard time discovering their strengths.
Can
But-
I add on to that?
Yes.
You had said something about reframing. I think that's where a lot of us don't have that creative mind to come up with what are other ways to approach that. I think it's the same question, a little bit more refined.
Okay. Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm actually very glad you asked it, because I skipped over an entire section that I really wanted to emphasize. And so it's great to have all sorts of reframes in your back pocket, right? Like yelling is one of the ones that it's intuitive. I see it. I jump in the session and I can reframe it as wanting to be heard and wanting to be listened to or validated. But oftentimes it's not as clear as that. So we have to do some detective work. And doing that detective work, we're going to ask more questions. If we're having a hard time finding the strength behind the behavior, we're having a hard time understanding, what is that positive aspect of what they're trying to accomplish there, I'm going to ask them more questions. And those questions can be something in the form of, what leads up to this behavior? What's going on before this happens? Then during what's happening, and then afterwards what's happening. And when you have that information, the before, during, and after, you're sequencing the events of the behavior, you have a better understanding of what they're trying to get out of it. Does that make sense? I mean, so if I'm looking at drinking, and the before, during, and after is, you have a fight with your partner. Okay, that's the before, that's the trigger. You have a fight with your partner, and then you storm off, and then that tends to be one of those times that you drink. And then what happens while you're drinking? Well, you start to feel better. How long do you feel better for? What happens after that? What happens a couple hours after that? What happens the next day? What does that impact? How does it impact you? How does it impact other people? And so now we have this sense of, the before is, we understand what that trigger is that you're uncomfortable in your relationship. So that's one of the triggers. So when we start to look towards skills, we might be addressing the relationship. Or we look at that discomfort and we start to address the emotional regulation of that discomfort. How do we address that in a way that doesn't rely solely on alcohol consumption? Or the after, we start to look at, what do you achieve from this? You might achieve the feeling better in that moment, or you might achieve something that's not as obvious. You might feel better in the moment, then you feel awful afterwards. What happens when you feel awful afterwards? Does someone ask you if you're okay? Does someone go and support you and try to help you? Does that feel good? Does your partner see that you're not doing well and they come to your aid? So perhaps the behavior might actually be drawing someone in at the same time. So it's not always clear that you're doing this to feel better because you feel really uncomfortable, but this behavior might also have a relational component to it and how other people react to it. And so we don't know that. Kind of back to your question, Brian, about, what if we can't see the positive? We have to understand more of what's going on before, during, and after to truly be able to see what this behavior serves for them. And we don't always know. Sometimes it's going to be, the work itself is me just doing that inquisitive process and trying to understand. I might have something of value to help them understand that I understand what they're experiencing, or help them understand what they're experiencing. But that whole process alone is therapeutic, because if I'm asking these questions, I'm truly trying to understand their experience. There's an attachment there, there's a connection there. And so I start to become that person that they can trust. And when they trust me, then I can start to influence behavior. There was a really good comment at the very beginning about, I try to avoid offering fix-its. You didn't say fix-its, but I try not to tell them what to do or how to do it. But when I have that relationship and that trust with my client, then I can start to offer some of those skills, offer some interventions, because they trust me as someone that understands them. If I try to say, hey, you just need to work on communication, they don't trust me, we don't have that connection. It's like, you're not listening to what's going on with us. You're telling us what to do without hearing what we actually have going on. So then we start to transition once we have, so I'm going to go backwards a little bit. We've engaged them, we've been responsive, we've been reliable, we've motivated them by helping them understand that what they're experiencing, I'm not seeing in a judgmental way. And we're offering some different definitions, some different reframes about why they're experiencing what they're experiencing. And that process is allowing that person to see that I'm someone who cares and is seeking understanding. I'm not fitting them into a box, right? That I'm really trying to understand how this behavior is a problem for them or not a problem. And then I'm offering some suggestions. I'm not telling them what to do or how to do, but I'm saying, I see when you do this, the intent is this, but it has this other outcome that's not what you're intending to do. I wonder if there's some other strategies that can be more effective at that. And when we can do that, when we can look at those other strategies that are more effective, then that person is willing to try them on. You can still keep drinking in your back pocket. I'm not going to be the one to say yes or no, but I certainly want you to have some autonomy in being able to make a decision of whether that's the most effective way of addressing this issue. And when there's some autonomy, there's less pushback. It's, you understand me and you're also respecting me in my decision-making process. And this is very different than a lot of the ways that addiction is approached. And other behaviors too. So then I move into that skill building once I feel like I have that alliance and I have that connection with a client. They see me as a person that understands them and not a hierarchy of a trained professional that's helping them. That's my goal, is I don't want to be seen as the trained professional. I do want to be seen as the professional that they can trust, but I don't want to seem that I'm the one that is going to take the notes and tell them what to do, but I'm going to seek understanding as a human being myself. And then I can help support you with the training that I have, because I have a different understanding of this, only because I've invested far more time than the average person maybe. And so then I look at skill building. And the nice thing about this is that when we understand what's underneath the behavior, we can target how we help that person. And so if I understand, and I know I'm repeating this a little bit, but if I understand that it's an emotional regulation issue, then I can work on skills towards emotional regulation. If I understand that it's a relationship issue, we can look at why the relationship is challenging and work on that. If I understand that it is a past trauma that's influencing the behavior, then I can approach that. And so it's not a one size fits all. I often hear couples will call and they'll say, hey, we need to work on our communication. It's like, well, why? Why do you need to, I mean, clearly your communication isn't working for you because you're calling, but why is the communication not working? What's underneath that? And so the intervention we have isn't going to be textbook. It's not going to be a one size fits all, but it's specific to that person and what their need is. And so it might be coping mechanisms. It might be self-care. It might be, based on a lot of what I'm saying, it might be building a much stronger sense of community, a much stronger support network, because perhaps that is contributing to your behavior. You're feeling isolated and you're feeling alone. So we're being really informed with how we address it. Any questions on that?
I think I have something, it's been touched on a little bit around being non-judgmental and whatnot. So I'll preface the question with acknowledging that we all have our own values, and some of our values are really strong. We have, like, some of us, I think, hard line that's this is acceptable behavior, and across that line is unacceptable behavior by anybody. What would you advise or suggest, or any feedback you might have when we're encountering somebody who's, in our mind, their behavior is over the line? It goes way against my own values, or the values maybe of even our Recovery Cafe community here. How do I work with that person?
Yeah, excellent question. And you work with them the same way as I was talking about, where I think, and it's important to emphasize, we're not saying that the behavior is okay, but we are looking at what's underneath the behavior. So we're starting with that. And when we understand what's underneath the behavior, we can emphasize, I see what you're trying to do, and I see that that's not effective for you. And then when it crosses that line to, wow, that is absolutely not okay, it's okay to be firm with that. We can use stronger words, and I can see how it's not effective for you. It's like, I want to be really clear that this behavior is not okay, but I understand where this behavior comes from. And that's the part I want to focus on. You know, and this is something that I would see. Functional family therapy is one of the few therapies that deals directly with domestic violence in families. You hear oftentimes, Barbara, hang on one second. You hear often how you shouldn't do therapy under a domestic violence situation because of that risk, Brian, of what you were saying, that I don't want to make it seem like that behavior is, I don't want to reframe it in a way that it's okay, I understand where it comes from. I need to be really clear that it's not okay. But at the same time, understanding where it comes from helps that person understand that I'm seeing you as a human being. I'm seeing these struggles. I understand where that emotional response triggers that fight or flight response, and where that domestic violence might show up. I want to be really clear that that is not okay and that can't happen. But I want to also understand more of where it comes from for you, so I can support you in addressing this in a very different way. And so there's a subtlety there, because I know at the beginning I may have contradicted myself a little bit, because I did say that that behavior was bad, but I didn't lead with that. I led with, I understand what's underneath that behavior. I'm not seeing you as a bad person. I'm seeing this behavior in the moment as bad, and that's not okay. Okay, Barbara, thanks for waiting.
Sure, I'm not the world's most patient person. Sorry about that.
It's okay. I'm better. Go ahead.
Well, my question is, I don't want to threaten withdrawing a relationship due to their behavior, but sometimes I feel like in order to save my own sanity, I have to do that. You know, this behavior that you're doing does not work for me at all. I can't have a relationship with you when you are acting this way. You frighten me, you endanger me. I don't want to be with you. I don't want to be around you when you're doing this. And yet that doesn't get to the root of it at all. And it feels really scary. It would feel really scary to me to hear that, but that doesn't seem to change the behavior. But
the way you said that, I think, is one of the best possible ways to approach it. And the reason why is that you're emphasizing the relationship, and you're emphasizing the impact that it has on you. And I think it is important, I think what's underneath what you're saying too, is that sometimes we might have the best intentions and the best approach, and we're not going to be able to change that behavior. And there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to change that behavior. But if we lead with the relationship, we lead with that connection, with the attachment, we're more likely to influence it. We can't always, though, but exactly what you were saying, that to be able to say that your behavior frightens me. You're not saying stop, that's awful. You're saying your behavior frightens me and it's scary and I can't be around it. So now when there's a strong attachment there, they're more likely to respond based on you're sharing very clearly that you can't be a part of that person's pack if they continue to threaten you in this way.
What about, you say that you approach them with, you don't agree with them, but you understand where they get that. What if you flat don't understand where they're coming from? I mean, there are things going on today that I do not understand where it comes from, and I cannot wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
So, and you can't talk to them because you can't break that barrier of just having a conversation when you're so diametrically opposed in thought process, morals, or something of that nature. What do you do then? I mean, I don't see a solution to that, that kind of a stand where some people won't listen to any other side of a issue other than their own. They kind of like have to be in their own echo chamber.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. And I think I think it's a good reminder too, that we're all human beings and we all have our various barriers and blocks, that it's not always going to be a fit. Where if I'm working with someone and the issue that they're dealing with is something that I'm sensitive to, I may not be able to see what's underneath that behavior as effectively with someone that I can feel more objective with. And so there's going to be times when it's okay to say, I'm not able to see this any different. I'm going to find some other resource for you or someone else to help out here. It might not be something that you say to them, but something that in your mind, you're able to acknowledge for yourself what your own limitations are. I know for me personally, if I'm working with young families and their kids happen to be the same age as my kids, I'm far less effective as a therapist because there's a lot of what might be going on in that family that's going to affect me more emotionally than if I'm more distant from it. So I want to be a part of the pack, and I want them to trust me. I want to build this relationship. And at the same time, I need to make sure that my own experience isn't getting in the way of me seeing it objectively. And so it's okay when you find that block. I think, John, your honesty with yourself is a really important one to see. I just can't see what's underneath that. I'm going to help you find someone that might understand you better. Okay. Are there any other questions on that aspect? So I want to review some of those steps in behavior change. And then we have enough time where I wanted to go, I kind of threw out communication as the kind of that classic, everyone says we got to work on our communication skills. And I think oftentimes we don't stop to look at what's underneath the communication and what we're getting out of it beyond just the words and being clear with our words. And so I want to spend a little bit of time with that. But before I do, just to go back, and I have some notes here that I'll have to review and make sure that they're all clear, but I can send them to Brian afterwards if anyone is interested in seeing kind of the outline that I'm going off of so that you can refer to it. But I outlined 4 steps in behavior change. So the first step is engagement, being responsive, being reliable. The next step is motivating to let that person know that we're non-judgmental. We're going to offer some reframes of their experience to help them see something in a different way. And that blends into what is the function of the behavior. What does that behavior serve for you? What's underneath it? And then when we know what's underneath it, we move into that 4th step of skill building. What are some more effective ways of addressing that? And so I wanted to emphasize communication as a skill because I find that this is one of the skills that everyone can benefit from, regardless of what's going on in their life. But communication, most importantly, has to do with how we build connection, how we build a secure attachment with others. And so the goal of my communication is to build connection, is to motivate, is to validate that person's experience. That any way that I'm communicating, I want to make sure that they have a sense of not just we're having an exchange of ideas, but their ideas and what they have to say is something that's important to me and that it matters to me. So that first step in communication I often think of is just showing that we're listening. You know, there's some obvious ones that I think are especially hard in this last year in the, you know, in the Zoom era. But, you know, in person, I think Zoom, there's certain strategies that there's going to be all sorts of research papers about how we connect over digital media after this pandemic. But when I see in person so much of, you know, how we present ourselves, where we're showing that we're listening through eye contact. I know many of you know these things, but it's a helpful reminder that we want to make eye contact. We look at our nonverbal, you know, our nonverbals, such as our posture, our presence, our peace of mind, of how we're showing up. So if I'm looking at you eye to eye, that shows that I'm listening. If I'm looking down, it might not show that I'm listening. If I'm writing notes, it might look like I'm more interested in my notes. But if I'm writing notes and looking up and balancing that, then that might be okay. So just taking note of, is this person feeling like I'm connecting with them physically in the way that we're making eye contact in my presence? If I'm crossing my arms, it might show that I'm a little bit guarded, I'm not as open. You know, if I'm sitting too far back, it might show that I'm disengaged. And so making sure that how we're showing up, you know, I made a comment the other day. I've been doing all sorts of walking sessions and it's been really sunny. And I learned as an outdoor educator before I became a therapist that whenever you're teaching a class, you never have sunglasses on so that they can see your eyes. And also look into the sun so that they're not looking into the sun and they're not distracted by that. And so much, you talk about cataracts with outdoor educators. And I found myself doing the same thing as a therapist in walking sessions. And we're walking into the sun and I don't have sunglasses on because I want to make eye contact every now and then as we're walking. You do the best you can given the circumstances. You don't need to sacrifice yourself. But those are things that I was considering in a walking session, making sure that I'm still present. We're walking in the same direction. If I had sunglasses on, that's one more barrier between us. Sometimes I'm going to put them on though, because I don't want to deal with cataract surgery too early. So beyond the presence, it's looking at how do we engage in that conversation right at the beginning. So we hear the term active listening often. What active listening implies is a part of listening, a part of communication that often gets missed. More often than not, someone will say something. As they're saying something, we start to form an idea of how we're going to respond, and then we respond. And we may be listening intently, but what we're doing in that moment might not be showing that person that we're listening, right? And so if we can take a couple steps and be the active listener, that might include paraphrasing what they have to say. Even if you're fully aware of what they said, you might say, hey, I understand, Barbara, that you were talking about the fear that you felt with some behaviors and how it didn't always feel safe. You already said it, but then I paraphrased it. And then just as you're nodding, you're like, yeah, that's exactly what I said. And so that feels good. You know that I was listening to what you had to say. So paraphrasing it can go a long way. Also asking a question. I can ask a question even if I know, if I'm pretty certain I understand you. Asking a question makes you know that I'm really invested in understanding it and I'm checking. Or I completely lost what you had to say. I didn't fully understand it, so I'm asking a question. That also shows that I care what you have to say. So again, we're building attachment, we're building connection, we're building that relationship so that we can start to influence behavior. So I'm going to check for meaning. I'm going to check for understanding. So I can paraphrase, I can ask questions. When I think I've got it, I'm going to check for meaning and say, hey, so I understand that you were experiencing this and it affected you this way. Did I get that right? That's not how we all talk. So say it in a way that feels normal, doesn't feel as robotic, but I'm going to check. I'm going to make sure I understand. And this is all before I've even offered my 2 cents. All I'm doing is building relationship right now. I'm showing this person that I care what they have to say, and I'm trying to understand it to the best of my ability. And I'm checking in with them to make sure I've understood it. And then I can reframe that experience. I'm not changing their experience, but if they're saying that they're struggling in one way or another, or this is a problem, I can then start to use some of those tools that we talked about before and offer them a different perspective. I can offer them a different perspective about how to see the problem in a way that they might not be blaming themselves in a way. They might blame themselves they're blaming themselves, but there's less blame there if I can reframe it. You know, if they're beating themselves up over something that happened in the relationship, and I can offer that reframe and say, hey, I understand that was really challenging. I can also see what your intent was there, but it wasn't very effective. So back to the skills that we were talking about before.
Real quick, Craig, I just wanted to read what one of our participants shared in the chat, which was, I
Yeah.
don't have to change my beliefs or values in order to understand another person's beliefs and values.
I love that. I love that because this has come up for some reason this week, especially in all of my sessions. I think with the pandemic, I'm doing a whole lot more family work and couples work just by the nature of how the pandemic has been so isolating for many people, because we don't need to change our beliefs and values to understand people. And we also don't need to agree with them to build connection and relationship. So often, I think, John, this was what you were referring to a little bit too, is that if you're never going to be in agreement on what's right or what's wrong about a particular thing, or the values don't coincide, it doesn't mean that you can't have a healthy conversation where each of you feels heard and understood despite being disagreed with. And so when I'm working with couples a fair amount, it's looking at that process of how do you use these active listening tools so that that person, so that both of you feel reassured that you're understood and that what you're saying is important to the other, even if they don't understand, or not, I'm sorry, not understand, but even if they don't agree with what you're saying.
Well, and if the relationship has some depth to it or meaning, you can both say on a subject A, B, or C that you agree to disagree and that's it, and then you don't broach the subject.
Yeah. Well, and I think adding some depth to that, we can use COVID as an example, that everyone has a very different idea of, we've seen such extremes of how to handle this. And, and oftentimes that is one of those topics where we can get stuck in the middle of disagreement, and then it can get volatile, it can get ugly, it can get mean. But if we seek that understanding of what's underneath it, we don't have to agree. That I can see that this is some of your concern and this is why you're making the decisions that you're making. Is that right? Did I understand correctly why you believe this? And when you get that agreement, okay, I'm glad that I'm understanding you. I have a different perspective and it's like this, and this is why I believe what I do. And if they do the same for me, we both are in agreement of, well, I can understand your opinion. I don't agree with it, but I at least feel like I was respected in that conversation. And again, I'm coming back to that pack animal, that when I feel that connection, then we have more of an ability to work through some of the challenges. We might be able to collaborate. We might be able to listen to each other enough to be in agreement, but if we're not, we still are an effective resource or support for that person, because we've shown that we might have some different views, but I am going to seek understanding if those views are different. Okay. That is the bulk of what I have. I'd love to open it up. You all are doing a really nice job of asking questions along the way. And I know I covered a lot of ground, so I can go more in depth into one area or another, or clarify some of what I covered. But I'd love to just open it up to everyone if you have questions about what I talked about, or if there's some specific barriers that you've run up against and ways that you might be able to address that differently.
Craig, this is Katie. I, the other day, ran into a problem, situation that I really reacted to, and that was someone started talking about their religion. And what I struggle with is when they don't own it as theirs, but they make statements like, these are the facts and this is the way it is.
So tell me, how did you address that when that happened?
I guess I responded in saying I felt very uncomfortable, and that it is important when you make a statement about religion that you kind of own it and say, I believe this, or I think this. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're kind of putting the other person on the defense.
Yeah.
And that I no longer felt safe in the situation, because statements were made as fact and not as a belief or a personal thing.
Yeah. So there are a couple things there, Katie, that I think are important, because I think that's a good example, kind of referring to whether or not the values or beliefs are different from our own, or the way that they're presented is a different way than we would expect. And so I would start with that by using that dynamic, that conversation about religion and what this other person, the way they're presenting it, as the behavior. So what's underneath that behavior that you're trying to address? So someone stating something as fact, my reframe in that situation might be, it's really important to you for me to for me to agree with you, isn't it? Like, this is a topic that really hits close to you, that it feels more comfortable for you for me to be in agreement, or it's important for you to have someone that understands you or is an ally, or whatever or you can even go the other direction of, I wonder if it feels risky if someone doesn't agree with you in that way. Does this threaten, if I have a different perception, does it threaten your beliefs in some way? And what you're doing by saying that, the way you're asserting yourself, the way you're stating that, you're acknowledging how important it is for them. But then, Katie, I think you did a really nice thing of saying how it affects you. So both exist, is that I can see why it's really important for you to state it as fact, and why it might be risky to share it as a belief. And let me tell you the impact that it has on me, because if I disagree, if I have a different perception, then I also don't feel safe in that situation, because I have a very different idea. And so now you're both able to talk about why I'm presenting it in this way and why that makes you uncomfortable and feel unsafe. And so now we can address it more as a relationship of, how is what you're saying or doing affecting me? And is there a way we can talk about religion that doesn't feel threatening to each other, so that we can have this conversation? So that might not change what they do, but it leads with the relationship of it. You're acknowledging why it's important to them, why they need to say it or do it in the way that they are. And then you're emphasizing the impact it has on you and what makes you uncomfortable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kathy, and I have a question. I've realized oftentimes when I'm in conversations with somebody and they make remarks similar to what Kate was saying, slowly but surely what I discover, if I'm able to stay with the conversation, is that oftentimes when you don't claim something as being your own, it's because you're actually using a belief system that belongs to somebody that you care about. It's not like you have done the work, or you've made an individual decision that that's the way you believe. You're repeating what you have heard from somebody that you respect or admire. So there isn't necessarily the personal connection. And I guess from listening to you talk, it's kind of what is under that is, not wanting to betray somebody else, not really wanting to question what it is that you're talking about. And it's easier to put it off on somebody else because you don't have the background to defend it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make it does make sense. And if I'm understanding you correctly too, that if you understand how important that belief is for that person, and how that's one of their strong attachments or senses of safety, I think leading with that and understanding why that's important to them, and emphasizing that one example, and I may not be understanding you fully, so let me know if I'm off the mark. But when I present the concept of attachment and addiction, sometimes I get some pushback. And the pushback I might get is from, let's say, someone who has received a lot of benefit from AA and working through a 12-step program. And if I incorporate an idea that maybe a way to approach this is not just the 12 steps, but let's look at relationship and let's look at attachments and community. And if that person puts their foot down and says, no, that's wrong, that's absolutely not accurate, that's not my experience, I think it's important for me at that point to understand too that this person feels really vulnerable and unsafe, that something that has worked for them and that might very well be the reason why they're still here today. My job isn't to tell them what their experience is wrong, but to acknowledge what role that serves for them. and to acknowledge the importance of that, and then offer a different perspective of how I see things, but also acknowledging how important it is for them to have this belief system, or to have this support that they don't want to be open to the idea that there might be some other ways of approaching it. And that's okay. That's the conversation we're having. We're building that relationship. And when I can acknowledge that, hey, that's a risky thing to be questioning what's worked for you and has kept you alive. And so I don't want to do that.
That's good.
Brian, this is Cecilia.
Hi,
And I
Cecilia.
have a son who was born with tuberous sclerosis complex, and it manifests in his brain. He has tubers. And so he's on a great, like 6 or 7 different medications, and that alone doesn't help him. He believes also smoking pot gives him the additional medication that he needs. What do you say to that?
Well, so what do you think, Cecilia, underneath the smoking pot, what is he trying to accomplish? I think you just said it, but your understanding.
Is that he's trying to feel normal like the rest of us.
Yeah.
And it makes him relaxed instead of having those agitated feelings that he feels, or the paranoia he feels being out in public. So I haven't fought it, but there's a public message that, hey, that stuff is bad. You're going to have worse things in the future. And so that's running behind my head. But I see, he's functioning better.
Okay.
So I've been perplexed about what to do.
Yeah. So the process there, I think you've done a nice job of looking at how that serves him well. You also have some concerns of how it might not be serving him well. And so I think it comes right back to looking at what's underneath the behavior and how effective is it at addressing the issue. And so the conversation, the important conversation would be, you can see the benefits are clear, but let's look at, are there other aspects of it that we're not seeing? When you do this, are there negative consequences? And there might not be for him, but there may be some that he hasn't seen. And so to be able to explore, what those negative consequences are. And when you can identify those, then you can have this more collaborative conversation of, I can see the benefit of this. I also see the disadvantages. I wonder if we need some additional tools in here to be able to address feeling differently. And sometimes there are, and sometimes there aren't, but that's the conversation that you're able to say exactly what you said, but in a non-blaming way. You're expressing concern, you're expressing worry for someone that you care about. And so you're leading with, I understand how uncomfortable it is and how this helps you feel comfortable. And I don't want to say that what you're doing to feel uncomfortable is wrong, but I also am curious, are there other outcomes, other consequences of using this to feel comfortable? Does it have a ripple effect? Does it affect other aspects of your life? And that's something we can talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges here is looking at, there's behaviors that we come across that are very concerning to us. And there's behaviors that we come across that we absolutely don't approve of and we want to address. But how we address them in a non-blaming way so that we can build that connection, build that attachment, so then we can influence the behavior better is what's key. And again, we're creating a relationship so that we can influence the behavior in a way that supports the person that we're connected with, the person that we're working with. Because we can't control it. We can't tell someone what to do or not to do. We're not the police. We're not the courts, but we are influencing behavior. And so when we influence behavior, we start with building a connection, showing that we're seeking understanding, that I'm someone that can be trusted. I'm someone that's a part of the pack. And so when I communicate in a way that reinforces that, where I'm trying to understand, I will immediately have a value judgment in my head, but I'm holding that back because I know that's human nature. We can't fight that. So we acknowledge it, but then we lead with, I want to understand more because I jumped to this and I know that there might be more than what I'm seeing. So I want to understand what their experience is. And Cecilia, in your case, that experience was, I see that this has a benefit for you. I want to understand fully what happens before, during, and after, remember. And it's the after that we might be emphasizing. Why is it a problem?
I appreciate your talk. You're very easy to understand. My situation is a little bit different in that I am living with my daughter and son-in-law and two granddaughters at 19 and 22 who are here periodically, depending on their college schedule. And my kids have been married for 35 years. I'm going to be 80 pretty soon. And so I'm not dealing with kids here, with children. But what I am dealing with is, and it took a long time and lots of therapy to understand why it happened. I've never approached it with my son-in-law because he's not ever gotten to the point where he would say, "Oh, so we did a really bad job there, didn't we?" When my first grandchild was born, that was my daughter and my grandchild. And I didn't have any trouble letting anybody know that. I had no thoughts about Bruce and how he would be feeling. And so my personality and my love for my daughter and for the granddaughter, I kind of bullied my way in until my son-in-law was really threatened. And so we fought, and one time it was physical, and my daughter was screaming because she stood up and said, "The two people I love the most in the world don't like one another." So it was pretty awful. I had to sneak in to see her and my granddaughter because he just had such a fit if he knew that I had been there at their home. So it went on for a long time, and there's still, after Maddie is 22, after all these years, it's still there. The animosity. We'll never be friends, but I decided about a year and a half ago, before I moved in, that I was going to change my attitude towards him. And I was successful with therapy. I was successful in that I saw him, began to see him as a human, and how he was raised, and the pressures that he puts on himself, and he gets no outside help, or hadn't up to that point. And so he would stomp around with this really bad attitude until my daughter said, "This isn't working, we have to get some help." And so they're in therapy, and it's doing well. But and so now what I did over this last year and a half before they got into therapy was I just saw him as a human being, the man that my daughter loves, and as a good dad, as good as he could be, and that he was fine. And I had no right to judge him and still be mad at him and all that. Well, then my health changed, and I am now living here. And so it got a little bit more necessary for me to not have him act the way he was acting, which was he never looked at me. He gave me a cold shoulder. He would move the chair in the dining room so I couldn't see him, and from the kitchen. And those behaviors just encouraged me to not be part of his unhappiness and his struggle. And so I just, whenever I saw him, I was very polite, and I said, "Hi, Bruce, and how are you doing?" And not long, just one sentence or less. And so over this, I've been here since the end of September. And I saw that it was working, that he didn't quite seem so afraid of me and angry at me. And so one morning I just felt fine, and I just thought, well, that's a beat. Well, I didn't really even think about it. I just walked in. He was sitting in the chair, and I said, Bruce, can I give you a hug? And he looked up at me and he said, what? And I said, can I give you a hug? And he said, me? I mean, it took him a full minute, I know, to understand what I was saying. He never expected it, but the joy, the joy that I saw in his face, his relief, it was just, it was wonderful. And so I did. And he stood up and he hugged me back. Now, I haven't had that for a long time. And so to feel a man's hand on my shoulder blade and really pulling me close was just incredible. And so I haven't done it since, but I'm always nice to him. I always ask him how he is. He never asks me, but he when I walk into a room, I say hi, and he says, hey.
Shirley, you just captured, that was an excellent summary of what was in my mind going into this, because one of the things, and I absolutely love that story, so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
What I especially noticed is I'm looking at that pack of yours and the volatility that existed, that fight or flight response when everyone was fighting for being a part of the pack.
Yeah.
There was a dynamic there that you guys cared about each other immensely enough for the fight, you know, and for that disconnect, whether it's, you know, to fight for inclusion in the pack or to fight for security or safety or to protect one another. And what you did is, the reason why it changed was that you started to see one another as people. And that was what was needed at the very beginning, of seeing one another as people and as a part of the pack. And then it seemed like suddenly there was this connection there, and the issue started to subside. So I love that example. I'm so happy for you.
Beautifully said. I'm going to play timekeeper here a little bit.
Yeah.
Because we've had a great volunteer training already today. Just want to say we've got about 10 minutes left. So Craig, if there were any summarizing, wrapping up, or if you want to take any more questions, I'll leave that to you. And then maybe 5 minutes till the end, and then I'll do our own wrap up too.
Okay. I don't have anything else to add. And so
I do. I do. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
I can.
This happens a lot in my entire life, not just at Recovery Cafe, but people talk my ear off. And when I'm meeting a new person, especially at Recovery Cafe, I want to listen and just, you know, get the relationship going. But sometimes it goes on forever. And it's just little stuff that people talk to me about and of no interest to me. And I keep thinking, well, what can I do about this? Should I just say, excuse me, I need to help in the kitchen, which I don't. Excuse me, I need to use the bathroom. I mean, I want to walk away at some point, but politely.
Yeah.
I hate being just ears.
Yeah. I've got a great response for you. Well, I'm just thinking through that attachment lens, and that at the time, I mean, it sounds to me that you're in this position where after the conversation goes on long enough, you're more distracted by what you have to do than the conversation.
No, I just want to get away from them.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your honesty. Well, because we don't always need to be honest. Don't edit that out of the video. But what I mean, though, is that there's ways that we can exit that reinforces that attachment, that you may not have the capacity to listen anymore, and you may just want to get away. But if you do it in a way that reassures that person that they're still cared for, I think that's ultimately your goal.
Yes.
And so I might say something along the lines of, I know you have a lot more to say. I'm really distracted because I need to get into the kitchen. Can we set this aside for another time when when you can have my undivided attention? Or something to that effect, that you're prioritizing that what you have to say is important. I'm not in the position right now to give it the attention it deserves.
Okay, I like that. Thank you.
And that's something that comes up in, couples all the time, that, I think, how do you find a way to find the appropriate timing for a conversation when one person might be emotionally flooded, the other one isn't, or one person is distracted by a work issue or something else going on. And I think that's a great way to address it, is what you have to say is too important for me to be distracted right now, or to have other things on my plate. Can we set aside another time?
Thank you.
Brian, when you give the notes, you said that there was going to be some notes. With that, could you you said something about having reframing situations, a pocket of it, or a storage of it. And so if you could give some of those, I'd appreciate that.
Okay. I do have just a couple listed on my notes right now, and I'll spend some time to brainstorm what some other ones might be, that, just some generic reframes to have in your back pocket. The challenge of I can think of them when you give me a situation, and it's hard to sometimes come up with, so I'll do the best I can. But I'll make sure that there's a couple on those notes for you. One thing I did, maybe this can wrap up, that when Brian and I were talking about this talk today, and I had asked him about the mission statement of the Recovery Cafe, and the reason why I wanted to know is that what we're talking about right now is exactly what the Recovery Cafe is doing. When we look at the mission statement, starts with community, and why the Recovery Cafe is so different from other programs out there, other resources out there, is that you are already leading with this attachment, this relationship, this connection-based approach. And it's even what I could say, I was talking a little bit about 12 steps in AA. I think that's a big part of what people get out of an effective AA program, is that community. There's a group of people that they feel listened to, they feel supported by, they feel like someone cares about what they're challenged with in that moment. And the Recovery Cafe is doing it in this way that fits into the community, so that it's a place people can stop by and feel safe and feel heard. And so already, just by the nature of what the Recovery Cafe is accomplishing this behavior change process right at the beginning. And then this is just kind of putting some language behind it a little bit of how is that sense of community facilitating that behavior change in a way that supports people best.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, well said. I so appreciate all of you guys for participating in our training today. Can we give a clap or a hand wave to Craig? Thank you so much for your time. For
Thank you, Craig.
the training.
You're welcome.
Just a couple quick announcements before we finish. Our next month's volunteer training, I'm looking up at the dates here, is June 18th. So Friday, June 18th, same time, 10 a.m. to 11:30. The topic is suicide prevention and intervention. That will be taught by the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Jefferson County, NAMI JEFCO. And also coming up, we have an outdoors event we're going to host here at Recovery Cafe. That's going to be Friday, June 11th. It's open mic and live music. So at 6 p.m. we'll do open mic. So you can come early to get signed up. And then at 7 o'clock, we're going to have live music by Clay Bartlett. I've got a link on our website that I'll send as a follow-up to this training, so you can go look up his music. But we'd love to see you there. We're debating about what if we were going to offer food or what that might look like, but we would love to see you. It's intended to be, well, free of charge, of course, family-friendly, drug and alcohol-free event. So come build community, have some fun. We'll be outside, so that'll be safer than gathering indoors. And we're hoping it's a good time. So I'll send more information about that. And for
Brian,
now,
can you share with the group what you'll be singing for open mic, so we can make a decision whether to go?
Well, I have been learning some lullabies for the babies, so maybe I'll play one. But no promises. We would love to see you guys there. I'll send out the info, and with that, I will bless and release you. Thank you again, and have a good Friday.
this.